back on. So recapping. Maybe I'll just do a recap of what I did because it was unclear, but I'm going to do it very quickly. So once more from the top. That most of the medical issues that we've talked about have been presented in prior presentations, going back to about 2016 and 2017. We're going to talk about the legislation for directly engaged, the legislation related to APP and AFP that Brian's already talked about. We'll briefly discuss the length of time it's taking for objections, consistency of rulings across Canada, and new issues that are popping up include the doctor being able to prove that they're involved in the protocols. Okay. Brian's already talked about the new Director General and the discussion paper and process. With respect to directly engaged, the direction that we have from the Director General's office so far is that the claimant will basically be able to claim the expenses as long as it's their own eligible expenses after reducing them for compensation received or receivable. So based on what Brian said, there's still a lot of uncertainty on what that means. So the Act itself talks about SR&ED being work that's directly undertaken by the taxpayer. However, the term directly undertaken is not described in the Income Tax Act. The closest term that's similar to that is directly engaged, which the SR&ED defines in its own policy paper. And basically, directly engaged means the people doing hands-on work and the first line of supervision on a technology basis. So the issue then comes around to, as Brian said, is the doctor's work directly undertaken on behalf of projects that they may either be running or maybe collaborating on? Okay. One of the other issues that's popped up quite a bit is really whether the doctor's entitled to exploit the results or has ownership of the results or is doing the results on behalf of someone else. And they'll look at things as to whose name's on the publications or certain issues like that, whether it's a medical corporation or whether it's actually the doctor himself or herself. And really, I'm not sure why this is even an issue, because going way back to the standing policy on entitlement to exploit, really all the taxpayer needs in order to claim a project is entitlement to exploit. And that's considered to be met where the taxpayer has a preferential right to use a patent, even if they're charged a royalty, or a preferential right to market or distribute the product in any way. And I think in the medical development, it's quite clear that the doctors are, in fact, able to do this. So when the 2012 policy papers came in, the I.2 that I referred to, 151R5, was replaced, and now the third-party payments policy basically reiterates the same information on entitlement to exploit and related results. What the problem is here is that now it's buried in a third-party payment policy paper rather than in the general paper, so there may be confusion that this policy might only apply to third-party payments. But I believe, according to SR&ED, that the 2012 policy papers, when they came out, were not representing any change in policy. I believe that the policy should still be the same unless there has, in fact, been a change in that emphasis. Okay. Getting on to the AFP issues. So Brian's already talked about different letters coming from different offices on whether AFP funding or surgical repair funding or other types of funding that a surgeon or a specialist may get may in turn be partially related to the SR&ED. So at this point, we don't really have any direction from, or clear direction, I'd say, from the Director General's office, other than that they're still going to apply the government assistance or contract payment policy until this issue is resolved. The legislation on this one is fairly clear that the amount that's claimed has to be reduced by any assistance that's reasonably considered to be in respect of the SR&ED. And that really brings up the issues of what's reasonably expected. So some examples in Ontario of what AFP and APP payments fund are listed, and they could be any number of specialties, they could be overtime work, they could be remote areas and work in remote areas, they could be related to clinical services, education, and they could be related to research. The problem is that, as Brian said, there's an argument that maybe none of that amount should be included at all. or an argument that perhaps there's positions in different papers as to how many or what proportion of the funding would be in, but really the problem is that there's very little direction from the hospitals on where the amount of research funding is. So that's a weakness supplied by the claimant or the taxpayer, that people in research or teaching hospitals often don't get the information to provide the breakdown on how much of the AFP payments are in fact tracked to research. In many cases they say that none of it is, or it's really indeterminate. So again, the hospitals could help by providing that kind of information. Okay, so basically at this point there's not a lot of direction from the CRA, and the issue's been outstanding for about 4 years, although we feel that there is an emphasis to get this solved. So things are moving, but there's complexities as we've outlined in the issues here. So some of our recommendations are, if we can get improved reporting by hospitals in the meantime to isolate the research component, this should help to resolve a lot of the assistance issues that we're facing. Secondly, if we can get more direction from the CRA and more consistency across claims, that will help in the meantime as well. One of the key things that we're talking about is that some taxpayers have talked about delays as much as 4 years on these claims that have been filed in objection. And what tends to happen is the medical professional corporation will stop claiming while their claims are in limbo. So again, this is kind of taking effect, and we'll look at some of the effects of this, I think, when we look at the statistics as to what's happening to the program in the next section. Also, we feel that there's an issue on consistency of the applications from region to region, in that there seems to be no central policy. So each region or district seems to be creating its own rules or sharing rules, and things that apply in one region may not be applied in another. Okay, and one of the final issues that we've seen pop up lately is that the CRA may